Architecture of Delusion, Mass Delusion, The Psychology of Conspiracy, and Pakistan's Most Lethal Belief. The delusion beneath the delusions. Every society carries delusions the way a body carries scar tissue, as a record of old wounds, thickened and hardened into something that no longer bends. Mass delusion is not the exotic disorder of a fringe. It is one of the standing capacities of the human mind operating at scale, and history offers no shortage of specimens. The medieval conviction that comets foretold plague, the conviction of entire nations in the 20th century that a neighbouring people was secretly poisoning wells or hoarding gold or plotting extermination, the conviction, still alive in corners of the wealthiest country on earth, that the moon landing was staged in a studio. What these share is not stupidity in any individual sense. Clever, educated people have believed all of them, but a specific failure of the collective mind under specific conditions, unbearable uncertainty, eroded trust, and a hunger for a story that restores the feeling of agency to people who have, in fact, lost control of their circumstances. Pakistan today is host to several such delusions running simultaneously, and they interlock. There is the belief that the state orchestrates terrorism against its own citizens. There is the belief, older and more diffuse, that the West, and America in particular, is the modern inheritor of the Crusades. A civilizational enemy still pursuing, 5 centuries after Granada fell, the destruction of the House of Islam. And beneath both of these sits a still deeper delusion, one almost never named because it flatters rather than frightens. The belief that Muslim societies remain, despite all visible evidence, at the centre of the world's historical stage, that history is still fundamentally organised around the drama of Islam and its enemies, rather than, having moved elsewhere, into rooms where Pakistan and its region are, for the moment, barely present. Of these, the conviction that the state manufactures terrorism against its own people is the most immediately lethal, because it does not merely distort perception, it disarms the population against the very violence killing it. This essay treats that belief as the primary case, but places it inside the larger architecture of delusion that makes it possible. Because a person who has already accepted that the West is an eternal crusading enemy, and that Islam is still the pivot on which world history turns, has already done most of the psychological work required to believe that his own state, staffed by fellow Muslims and fellow Pakistanis, is nonetheless a tool of that same eternal enemy, or at minimum indifferent to using terrorism as its own instrument. 2. The psychology of conspiracy. Why we believe the need for agency in a chaotic world. Human beings are pattern-seeking creatures, wired to detect agency where none exists and to build narratives that restore order to a chaotic universe. When suicide bombs tear through a marketplace, when soldiers are ambushed in the mountains, when worshippers are slaughtered in their mosques, the mind recoils from randomness. Someone must be behind this, it insists. There must be a plan, a purpose, a puppet master. For many Pakistanis, the state, and specifically the military establishment, fills that role, powerful enough to be capable of such machinations, opaque enough to sustain suspicion, and historically implicated in enough genuinely questionable actions to lend the accusation a veneer of plausibility. The comfort of certainty and the erosion of trust. There is profound psychological comfort in certainty, even false certainty. The conspiracy believer does not have to wrestle with the ambiguous reality that militant groups are complex ecosystems with their own internal rivalries and logics. He possesses a master key, the state did it, that unlocks every door at once. This certainty transforms the victim of terrorism from a passive sufferer of random violence into a witness of a grand and legible drama. And his suffering acquires meaning it would not otherwise have. But this narrative requires soil to grow in, and that soil is eroded trust. Pakistan's history offers that erosion in abundance, broken promises, betrayed expectations, institutions that have repeatedly failed to protect, to deliver justice, to educate, to heal. Each failure chips at the foundation. If the state is understood to lie about the economy, about governance, about the conduct of its own security forces, then disbelieving its account of who is killing its citizens requires no great leap. What begins as a healthy wariness of concentrated power metastasizes, over enough failures, into a pathology that forecloses any constructive engagement with reality at all. 3. Historical amnesia and the weight of the Afghan Jihad. To understand the present delusion, the past must be confronted honestly, not as morality tale, but as a chain of decisions, miscalculations, and consequences nobody fully foresaw. The Afghan Jihad against Soviet occupation united Pakistan across its usual divides. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, the secular populist, supported it. General Zia-ul-Haq, the Islamist dictator, escalated it. The United States, Saudi Arabia, and China all poured in resources. It was, in the geopolitical imagination of the era, a righteous cause. But the law of unintended consequences operates without mercy. The jihad militarized Pakistani society in ways barely understood at the time. It introduced weapons, ideologies, and networks that proved impossible to fully retire once the war that justified them had ended. It created a generation of men whose only trained skill was fighting, and normalized the idea that religious violence could be a legitimate instrument of state policy. Pakistan in the 1980s did not intend to create the Taliban, did not foresee September 11th, did not anticipate that its own protégés would one day turn their weapons on their former patrons. But outcomes, unlike intentions, do not ask to be excused. In the Pakistani collective memory, the Afghan Jihad occupies a strange double place, a source of pride for having helped bring down a superpower and a source of unresolved anxiety for the cost that victory continues to exact. Out of this tension grows a familiar narrative. We were used by the Americans, abandoned once the Soviets left, made to bear the consequences of decisions that were never fully our own. The psychological distance from "we were used" to "we are being used now" to "our own state is using us" is short indeed, however dubious the logic connecting them. 4. The Taliban conundrum and the ruin of the repressed. The Pashtun tribes straddle the Durand Line, a colonial artifact dividing families and clans that never asked to be divided. For many Pashtuns, loyalty to tribe has historically outweighed loyalty to a distant state, not as moral failing, but as a reality shaped by geography and the weakness of central institutions. Pakistan's support for the Taliban must be read in this light, not, as conspiracy theorists insist, a scheme to destabilize Afghanistan for its own sake, but an attempt, however badly it aged, to secure a friendly regime on the western border against a country that has always feared encirclement by India. The miscalculation lay in imagining the Taliban as a controllable proxy. They proved instead to be an ideological force with its own logic and its own refusal to recognize any external authority, which is precisely the distinction conspiracy narratives collapse. Supporting a group and controlling it are entirely different achievements. Pakistan supported the Taliban. It did not control them. When they sheltered al-Qaeda and refused to break with Osama bin Laden, Pakistan discovered, at heavy cost, that it had backed a horse it could not steer. The Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan represents the starkest failure of this policy. Pakistani Pashtuns, radicalized by the Afghan conflict, turning their weapons on their own state. The TTP's emergence after the 2007 Lal Masjid operation is a favorite exhibit of conspiracy theorists. The state stormed the mosque. The TTP arose soon after. Therefore, the state created the TTP. This is causal reasoning of the crudest kind, one that erases the tribal elders who chose to shelter foreign fighters, the ideological currents already moving through the tribal areas, and the accumulated grievances that gave the insurgency its fuel. The TTP did not emerge because the state wanted it. It emerged because the state had already lost its grip on forces it had once deliberately unleashed. The dogs of war slipped their leash, and when they turned on their former masters, those masters were as astonished as anyone. 5. The destruction of the Pashtun intellectual tradition. One of the great tragedies of Pakistan's recent history has been the destruction of Pashtun secular and progressive leadership, the tradition represented by the Awami National Party and its predecessors, tracing its lineage to Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, the frontier Gandhi, who stood beside Gandhi in pursuit of a shared, undivided independence. These leaders and the communities behind them became direct targets of militant violence, and here the conspiracy theorist finds his most emotionally persuasive ammunition. The state failed to protect the secular Pashtun leadership. Therefore, the state wanted the Islamists to prevail. Therefore, the state orchestrated their destruction. The logical leap remains as wide as ever, even here. That the state failed to protect these leaders does not mean it conspired to remove them. That its policies were misguided does not make them malicious. That its security apparatus made catastrophic errors of omission does not make it complicit in murder. The destruction of Pashtun intellectual leadership was a tragedy of the first order, but a tragedy born of incompetence and of forces the state had unleashed and then failed to recapture, not of conspiracy. And for the Pashtun community itself, caught between a secularist tradition and an Islamist one, the conspiracy narrative offers an emotionally convenient exit. This is not a conflict within our own community, it is a plot imposed upon us from outside. That exit is comforting. It is also false, and the refusal to walk through the harder, truer door, the one that requires reckoning with internal division, only prolongs the violence it seeks to explain away. 6. The economic argument and its collapse under its own weight. One of the more persistent variants of the conspiracy holds that the state orchestrates instability deliberately in order to attract foreign aid, that terrorism is, at bottom, a revenue strategy. The economic illiteracy required to sustain this belief is remarkable. Billions of dollars have been consumed in direct military expenditure. Trillions of rupees have been lost in foregone growth, in foreign investment that never arrived, in tourism that collapsed. The ordinary costs of security infrastructure, insurance, and compensation to victims run into the hundreds of billions. No rational actor purchases uncertain foreign aid at the price of a devastated economy, a shattered international reputation, and a domestic humanitarian catastrophe. The theory persists not because it withstands scrutiny, but because, like all such theories, it performs a psychological function regardless of its truth. It makes an incomprehensible world comprehensible. The theory grows still more absurd, set against Pakistan's most consequential relationship of the present era, its partnership with China. The China-Pakistan economic corridor represents tens of billions of dollars in investment that depends, above all, on stability and security in precisely the regions most afflicted by militancy. No state courting that scale of Chinese capital would rationally manufacture very instability capable of driving it away. The conspiracy theorist does not pause over this. The narrative must be preserved, even at the cost of ignoring the most basic economic and geopolitical arithmetic. 7. The ghost of the Crusader, the West as eternal enemy. Beneath the belief that Pakistan's own state secretly makes war on its people lies an older and more diffuse conviction, one that supplies the emotional scaffolding for the newer belief to stand on. That the modern West is simply the Crusader returned, that the destruction of the House of Islam remains, 8 centuries after Salahuddin retook Jerusalem, the unbroken project of Western power. In this reading, every American drone strike, every Western intervention, every diplomatic pressure applied to a Muslim government is not a discrete act with its own particular causes, but another chapter in a single, unbroken war that never ended in 1187 or 1492 and never will. This belief is not manufactured from nothing. Those who hold it can point to real historical material and feel, sincerely, that it vindicates them. The atomic destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the deliberate firebombing of Dresden and Tokyo, remain, in the minds of those inclined to see the West as an essentially violent civilization, proof of a capacity and a willingness to inflict civilizational-scale destruction that no professed concern for human life can fully explain away. These events are real, and they are cited by believers in the Crusader narrative not as paranoid invention, but as historical evidence, which is precisely what makes the narrative difficult to dislodge by argument alone. A delusion built entirely on fabrication collapses the moment its fabrications are exposed. A delusion built on real atrocities, selectively arranged into a single continuous story, while everything that complicates that story is discarded, is far more durable, because every fact within it happens to be true. What the narrative discards is precisely what falsifies it as a general theory of Western intention. And the clearest available case is Kosovo. In the 1990s, as Yugoslavia broke apart, Bosnian and later Kosovar Muslims were subjected to campaigns of ethnic cleansing and mass killing by Serbian forces. Srebrenica standing as the starkest single atrocity, a massacre that unfolded to the permanent shame of the international system under the passive eyes of United Nations peacekeeping troops who had neither the mandate nor the will to stop it. It was not the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and not any coalition of Muslim states, that ultimately intervened with decisive force to stop the killing and secure Kosovo's eventual path to independence as a Muslim-majority nation in the heart of the Balkans. It was NATO, under a Democratic American President, Bill Clinton, who bypassed a paralyzed United Nations Security Council altogether and ordered the bombing campaign against Serbian forces that finally ended the killing. This is not a small historical detail. It is a direct falsification of the Crusader thesis in its simplest form. The United States, acting through NATO, deployed its military power to protect Muslims from a Christian-identified aggressor, at a moment when no comparable action came from within the Muslim world itself. The honest account of American motive is not romantic. The intervention served clear strategic interests of its own, chief among them preventing a wider Balkan war on Europe's doorstep and reasserting NATO's relevance after the Cold War, and it would be its own kind of naivety to claim otherwise. The point is not that Western power acts from selfless concern for Muslim suffering. It acts, as all great powers act, from calculations of interest. The point is that this is precisely the same standard by which Western action toward the Muslim world should be judged everywhere else, as strategic calculation, sometimes aligned with Muslim interests and sometimes opposed to them, rather than as a single continuous theological war against Islam as such. A civilization capable of bombing Belgrade to protect Kosovar Muslims on strategic grounds is not a civilization organized around the medieval project of destroying the House of Islam. It is a civilization that has, in its own operative logic, moved past the religious framing of conflict altogether, which is a harder and less flattering truth for the Crusader narrative to absorb than any accusation of hypocrisy would be. 8. The illusion of centrality, decline, mistaken for siege. There is a final layer beneath even the Crusader narrative, and it is the hardest of the three to see clearly, because unlike the belief in a conspiring state or a conspiring West, it does not feel like paranoia from the inside. It feels like importance. It is the conviction rarely stated outright but present beneath almost every version of the conspiracy narrative, that the Muslim world remains at the center of history's stage, that great powers organize their strategies primarily around the containment or destruction of Islam, that the fate of the Muslim Ummah is still the axis on which the world turns, as it perhaps was, in a genuine sense, during the centuries of the caliphates, the Ottoman advance into Europe, or the Mughal Empire's wealth and reach. The uncomfortable truth is closer to the opposite. Muslim societies across much of the world have, by most measures that matter, scientific output, higher education, industrial innovation, the capacity to project ideas rather than merely oil revenue declined relative to the rest of the world over the last 2 centuries. And the last decade has supplied a particularly vivid demonstration of how shallow that decline can leave even its wealthiest members. The oil-rich Gulf states built glass towers that reach farther into the sky than almost anything on Earth, and yet those same states, when tested by actual security crises in their own region, have shown themselves dependent on foreign militaries, foreign mercenaries, and foreign technology for their own defense. Height of buildings is not depth of strength. There is an old truth, easy to state and hard to live by, that it is not gold, but men who make a nation great, and by that measure, the roll call of Muslim scholars commanding genuine renown on the world academic stage today is startlingly short. Akbar S. Ahmed, the Pakistani origin anthropologist working from Washington; Tariq Ali, the London-based historian and essayist; Tariq Ramadan, whatever the controversies that have since attached to his name. A civilization of nearly 2 billion people ought to produce more than a small handful of thinkers whose names carry weight in the world's leading universities and journals. And the fact that it does not is a more honest measure of present standing than any claim of civilizational siege. It is tempting and flattering to read this decline itself as further proof of the conspiracy to say that Muslims are held down deliberately, kept from their rightful centrality by external design. But a more rigorous lens, borrowed carefully from Hegel rather than applied loosely, suggests something less comforting and more internally focused. Hegel measured the advance of a society's historical maturity by the degree to which the consciousness of freedom under law had been internalized by its people, not merely proclaimed in a constitution, but genuinely lived, so that law is experienced by the ordinary citizen as rational and self-given rather than as the arbitrary will of a powerful man standing over him. By this specific and narrow measure, much of Pakistani society, and much of the wider Muslim world besides, retain structures that are functionally feudal in substance even where they have been renamed in the vocabulary of the modern nation-state. Land, patronage, and protection still flow from powerful local figures rather than from impersonal institutions. The common citizen frequently experiences law not as something he possesses and can invoke, but as something done to him by whoever currently holds power over his village, his tribe, or his case file. Where this is the lived condition of most citizens, the concept of individual liberty as something inherent and self-evident, the very foundation on which a modern, rights-bearing political consciousness would need to rest, has not yet been internalized as a genuine possession of the common mind. This is offered as a diagnostic lens rather than a verdict. Hegel's own framework has been challenged, not unreasonably, for quietly treating a particular European path of legal development as the normative endpoint of all history, and the diagnosis should be held with that caveat attached rather than as settled judgment. But as a description of where the harder work of building a modern political consciousness remains undone, it points inward, toward institutions that Pakistan itself has failed to build, rather than outward, toward an enemy that supposedly prevents their building. Those who insist most forcefully that the West conspires against Pakistan's Muslims are, in this light, often the very people who have least absorbed how modern great power politics actually operates as a calculus of interest, alliance, and strategic advantage, largely emptied of the theological framing that organised conflict in the medieval period. They remember Hiroshima and Dresden as proof of an undying religious war, while forgetting, or never learning, that Belgrade was bombed to save Kosovo's Muslims, and that Washington's calculus in each case was strategic rather than confessional. The West has moved on to a different register of thinking about power. A significant part of the Muslim world, and a significant part of Pakistan in particular, has not yet made that same move, has not yet stopped reading its own predicament as still, secretly, at the centre of everyone else's story. 9. The psychological profile of the believer. Cognitive dissonance and the need for meaning. The conspiracy believer is not irrational in the clinical sense. He is engaged in a genuine psychological struggle to make sense of an incoherent set of facts. He is a citizen of a country that claims to be Islamic, yet is bitterly divided over what that even means. A citizen of a country that has fought repeated wars with India, yet depends on international assistance to function. A citizen of a country that insists it is fighting terrorism while being repeatedly accused, not without evidence, of having once sponsored some of its instruments. This dissonance demands resolution, and the conspiracy narrative offers a single explanation that resolves all of it at once. The state is lying, the state is manipulating, the state is the source of the problem. The explanation is simplistic. It is also, psychologically, deeply satisfying, because it transforms a confused participant in an incomprehensible situation into a clear-eyed truth-teller who has pierced the veil that fools everyone else. The narcissism of victimhood and the need for agency. There is a narcissistic undertow to conspiracy belief, a quiet self-flattery in the posture of the undeceived. I am not like the credulous masses. I have seen through the lies. Social media reinforces this constantly, sorting the believer into echo chambers where every fellow believer confirms both the theory and the believer's own special insight. This narcissism blocks the very possibility of revising the belief, since to abandon it would mean surrendering not just an idea, but an identity. Beneath all of this sits the same need for agency identified at the outset. If the state orchestrates the violence, then the state can also stop it. If the violence has a hidden author, it has a purpose. And if it has a purpose, the citizen is not simply a random casualty, but an unwilling participant in a legible drama. This is the full psychological payoff of the belief, repeated now at 3 nested levels: the state as secret author of terrorism, the West as eternal crusader, Islam as history's true centre, each one converting helplessness into meaning, chaos into order, and victimhood into a strange, bitter form of significance. 10. The consequences. Why this delusion is the most lethal. Among Pakistan's several interlocking delusions, the belief that the state manufactures terrorism against its own people is the one that kills most directly, because its effect is not merely to distort understanding, but to disarm resistance. A citizen convinced that the state is the true author of violence is less willing to support counter-terrorism operations, less willing to share intelligence with security forces, less able to see the militant standing in front of him as an enemy rather than as a fellow victim of the same conspiracy. This is not a theoretical risk. In the tribal areas, where state authority has always been thin, militant groups have weaponized precisely this narrative to recruit fighters and win local sympathy. The state wants to destroy you, they say. We are your true protectors. Join us against the real enemy. And because the conspiracy narrative has already been internalized by so many, that message finds fertile, prepared ground. The delusion also deepens Pakistan's existing fractures along ethnic, linguistic, and sectarian lines by supplying each aggrieved group with the same convenient villain. When Pashtuns come to believe the state specifically targets them, they drift from the national project. When Sindhis believe the state is stripping their resources, they withdraw from national institutions. When Baloch believe the state is their active oppressor, the federation itself loses its claim on their loyalty. In this sense, the conspiracy narrative functions as a slow, self-inflicted wound. It turns citizens against the very state whose functioning their own security depends on, eroding the basic social contract that any functioning country requires. And the ultimate beneficiary of all this is Pakistan's actual enemy. When citizens believe the state is the true author of terrorism, they are less able to see clearly the militants who have killed tens of thousands of their fellow Pakistanis. This is exactly the narrative the militants themselves prefer to be seen as defenders of the people against a predatory state, as the true guardians of Islam against an illegitimate government. By internalizing the conspiracy, ordinary Pakistanis perform the militants' ideological work for them, at no cost to the militants at all. 11. The path forward, reclaiming reality. The most durable, long-term remedy is education, not simply more schooling, but schooling that builds critical thinking, the capacity to evaluate evidence, and tolerance for the ambiguity that reality actually contains, rather than the comforting simplicity that delusion offers instead. This requires overhauling curricula and retraining teachers on a scale Pakistan has not yet attempted, but it is not on the evidence of other societies that have faced comparable crises of trust, an impossible task. A second and equally necessary remedy is the strengthening of institutions themselves, since citizens will always seek alternative explanations for events. When the police are corrupt, the courts are slow, and the government demonstrably incompetent. Trust cannot be commanded into existence by rhetoric. It must be earned back through governance that is visibly better, more transparent, and more accountable than what it replaces. A third remedy is historical honesty, applied without flinching in either direction. This means acknowledging that the Afghan Jihad was a strategic error, understandable within its Cold War context, but an error nonetheless. That support for militant proxies was driven by genuine geopolitical anxiety rather than malice, and that unintended consequences, however catastrophic, are not the same thing as a hidden agenda. It also means applying the same honesty outward, recognizing Kosovo alongside Hiroshima, recognizing that Western power operates by the ordinary, unsentimental logic of strategic interest rather than by an unbroken theological war against Islam, and recognizing that Muslim society's present difficulties owe at least as much to internal institutional failure, captured precisely in the persistence of unindividuated, quasi-feudal legal relations Hegel's framework helps to name, as to any external design. Finally, there is the matter of collective psychological healing, which is slower and harder to legislate than any of the above. Pakistan is, in a real sense, a traumatized nation. The trauma of partition, of repeated military dictatorship, of decades of terrorism, layered one atop the other without ever being fully processed. Healing this requires moving beyond the psychological comfort of victimhood toward the harder, less flattering posture of agency, accepting responsibility for shaping the future while still recognizing, honestly, the real historical forces that have constrained the past. 12. Conclusion. The courage to think. The claim that Pakistan's own state orchestrates terrorism against its own people is a delusion, a dangerous and destructive one that serves no interest except that of Pakistan's actual enemies. But it cannot be dismissed with contempt because it is not, at bottom, a failure of intelligence. It is a failure of trust, compounded by a historical trauma never fully processed, and reinforced by two deeper and older delusions that make it feel almost natural. The conviction that the West remains an eternal crusader against Islam, selectively supported by real atrocities and conveniently silent about Kosovo, and the still deeper conviction that the Muslim world remains history's central stage, when the truer, and harder diagnosis visible in glass towers built on imported security. In a roll call of world-renowned Muslim scholars that can be counted on two hands, in law still experienced by ordinary citizens as the will of powerful men rather than as their own rational inheritance points inward, not outward. The believer in these delusions is not evil. He is, more often, afraid a citizen of a country that has repeatedly failed him, a participant in a history that has been genuinely cruel to his people at various points, a man searching for meaning in circumstances that can feel meaningless. What Pakistan owes him is not contempt, but something more difficult to supply: a realistic account of its own situation, an honest reckoning with its own institutional failures, and a coherent vision of a future built on internal reconstruction rather than external blame. It owes him, in short, the courage to think the courage to see the state's real failures without inventing a conspiracy to explain them, to see the West's real history without collapsing it into an eternal war, and to see Islam's present condition clearly enough to begin repairing it, rather than mistaking its decline for a siege. The choice, as ever, is between the hard work of reclaiming reality and the softer, more seductive comfort of continuing to live inside a story that was never true. Pakistan has indulged the second option for a long time. The time for the first is now. This essay is a personal analytical reflection by me, extending an original psychological examination of Pakistan's conspiracy culture into a broader philosophical account of mass delusion, drawing on the Hegelian concept of the internalization of law and freedom, and on the historical record of Western intervention in Kosovo as a test case against the narrative of the West as perpetual crusader.